I think it's fair to say that NCLII, this center, and this exercise is part of an effort to kind of resurrect the idea that there are kids who need intensive intervention. And then so it begs the question then, what do we mean by intensive intervention? And there are a lot of different ways of thinking about it, and perhaps going forward with it. So one of the ways is, the CBM kind of work that was done a long time ago. Data-based individualization or data-based instruction, using assessment and instruction back and forth in a dynamic way is one way to do it. But there are other ways of thinking about and operationalizing intensity of instruction, including, cognitive training and integrating cognitive training perhaps with, in some fashion, with instruction.
Okay.
So that brings us to you.
Okay.
So you want to add anything more to that, Devin, in terms of why Lee?
No, I mean, I think he happens to know a little bit about this topic, and so we thought that you would be a great person to talk about that, so that's it. I mean, I think that's perfect.
Does Lee have a copy of the questions?
I think so. Lee, do you need me to resend it to you?
I got the questions. I think you sent it yesterday. Yes, I've got 6 questions. 6 questions. Is that what I'm supposed to have?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. They're a little different than the earlier ones. Well, maybe they're not so different. The other earlier one kind of focused on aptitude, treatment, interaction sorts of things, but I guess this would too.
Yeah. So we actually, if you look at the page before, we have a description of kind of the different ways of thinking about intervention.
Okay.
And then the way we thought we could kind of get at that was by kind of contrasting the idiographic and nomothetic kind of approaches to things. And sort of thinking about aptitude by treatment interactions are more of an idiographic way of thinking about, intensive intervention. And so we thought that might be a way to kind of get at that.
Okay.
So we're more interested in a broad way in what Doug is talking about.
Okay. All
so
right.
are you comfortable, Lee, with the terms idiopathic, nomothetic? I mean, you want us to use different terminology?
Well, I haven't used those terms, but I kind of have an idea, and it depends if you go to the medical literature how it's defined, and how it might be defined in education literature. But I think you're talking about individual differences, or maybe group as a group, looking at characteristics within a group, sort of contrast. And so, it's probably not an either-or sort of thing. It depends on what your research questions are and that sort of thing. Yeah. So, I can talk about, the area of cognition where I think it fits. Maybe, I don't know if that's appropriate. Devin, do you want me to, what would you like me to respond to first?
Yeah, I guess maybe we can, let me just kind of read the questions, and then you can kind of, then you can just say whatever you think is a good thing to say. Doug, do you want to do it a different way, Doug?
No, I just want to make sure that Lee understands there's a right and a wrong answer to these questions.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I think I think you kind of have to back up just a tad bit. I think so you're really interested in designing interventions that are going to help kids who are at risk or have diagnosed disabilities, and I think it depends kind of how you look at the research question, but I think that you do find more recently we're doing a better job of defining sort of key cognitive variables that might play an important role in treatment outcomes. I think you go back to the 70s literature, and we didn't do a very good job, and there was power issues, and the constructs were kind of amorphous, like visual learner, auditory learner, that sort of thing. So I think we've done a much better job from the experimental literature of kind of looking at characteristics of kids that might sort of interact with the treatment approach that is provided. So I think when you talk about intensity of intervention, I think, you're assuming that the intervention matches the kid pretty well, and there's good evidence, and this kid is going to eventually respond. And I think that works generally speaking, but obviously we know there are such things as individual differences, and there might be a better way, a better approach with some other kids. So I think there's some potential interactions. I don't think the field has really progressed a lot in sort of identifying some of those cognitive variables that would moderate treatment outcomes, but I think there's a little progress being made. I think there are some ways to look at the intensity of intervention, and if we're going to look at some sort of a spin-off in the area of cognition or how kids think about certain things, then I think in the design of materials, I think there's some things to keep in mind. I think one is, I don't know if the literature is that strong about teaching to cognition, and that in a sense is going to generalize in a sense to some of the things we find important in the classroom, like reading comprehension or problem solving or calculation, word identification. But I think you can turn it around a little bit and put those cognitive kinds of activities within the academic domain or in the materials, and then you might find that you not only help kids through intense intervention in mastering a particular academic domain, maybe mastery isn't appropriate, and you might also find that there's some sort of a generalization to some cognitive aspect that they've also improved upon. So those are just some of my thoughts on the intervention part.
So if I could interrupt for a second, so what you're talking about is something that my colleagues and I have been working on a fair amount the last several years, and and what we do is we make the same sort of distinction that you're making, and we discuss it in terms of domain general and domain specific.
Right.
Training, and as you well know, at least in the area of working memory, for quite a long time now, there's been this really strong bias in favor of domain general training, and it's just been relatively recently that I think more and more people are asking the question: can we, just as you said, embed some of this stuff in instruction such that the instruction takes on some of the features of the training, and the training takes on some of the features of the instruction.
Right. Yeah. No. I think that's. I think the field of learning disability probably made a big mistake in its earlier inception, where we sort of looked at process and thought if we taught processes, we're going to find some sort of generalization, and then the field made this huge shift in terms of just focusing on academics. And I think we're now coming back to seeing, well, there are some general processes that we can teach, and it might generalize to some small parts of academia. But if you turn it around a little bit and focus on the academic domain and then embed the cognitive components within those academic domains, that you might find also a two-prong effect. One is could be potential changes in the academic behavior. Along with that, you could find changes in, let's say, working memory or some other aspect. And so, I think that's a fairly good direction. I haven't been as convinced I've been doing research in memory for a long time. I've never really quite felt that teaching memory per se, I think I lost the screen here, but teaching memory per se is going to help kids do well in some areas. But you can't remove memory from, the fact that you can see a word and tell me what it is means that you have a memory. And so you can't take that construct away. But I don't know if you just teach memory in a general sense, if you're going to find that the kid's going to remember a word more efficiently, or pull up a concept more efficiently, or that sort of thing. So there's sort of an interaction that goes on, and so I think the field is kind of getting a healthier perspective than it used to be. You know, I have my old behaviorist friends who sort of argue that, you know, it's kind of like a hardware software. You know, they just want to look at the software and they don't want to look at the hardware. They don't want to, you know, and I don't think you can do that, you know. But I think the field has kind of made some, you know, kind of gone maybe early on in LD in the wrong direction, but I think it's kind of coming back and it's a little bit more empirically based and so forth. So I think that interaction's a good thing that's happening.
So you know, you've done really good work, descriptive work, and you've also done intervention work. With respect to the intervention work, do you feel that the intervention work has, in small or larger ways, changed how you think about the kids about whom you're most interested in your research? Yuri Bronfenbrenner said many years ago, the best way to understand something is to try to change it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. You know, I don't consider myself an intervention researcher in a general sense. I think I got into it indirectly. I you know, in the late 80s and 90s, mid 90s, I did a meta-analysis of most of the intervention research that had control conditions that was published in the literature in LD, and that's a big area. And from looking at the effect sizes and the components that made up different interventions, I got the feeling that a lot of things work. And so from that, I was a little bit concerned in terms of how you relay that kind of information to an audience such as teachers. A lot of things were found to work, and I think I came to the conclusion that I'm going to get to your question about change in a minute, but I came to the conclusion we don't have good definitions of control groups, and until we have good definition of control groups, I'm a little pessimistic about what kinds of changes we are going to actually be able to implement. I remember Reed Lyon put something together years ago where we kind of came together and talked about sort of the outcomes of meta-analysis. And my plea was, if we're going to make real advances in the field of intervention research, we're going to have to establish what we already know works in terms of predicting effect sizes. And we're going to have to put those components together in the control condition, and then we can begin to look at and make advances within the field. And so, you know, so if you're going to talk about change, you know, I'm a little hesitant only in the sense that we really haven't done a good job of saying, look, here is a list of components that we know generally that work. And if we're going to, and we know they work overall under various sorts of conditions, but we need to put that together in a control condition, and then we need to be actually developing things that we think are unique, or something that's we think is going to make some sort of dent in the child's performance. And until we did that, we will always show change. You know, when you do a comparison of a treatment condition to instruction as usual, I think that's a disaster. It's a disaster happening because you're always going to find basically some variation. I mean, you can throw the kitchen sink in there and you're going to find differences with a control condition. And therefore, how are you going to really get down to sort of this fine-grained thing of what we call change? And so I think until some precursors take place, it's very difficult to, you know, make some sort of advances.
So that's an interesting conception of the control group, because where I thought you were going, and when you started talking about this, is, you know, that it's a kind of unfair and you know, overly flattering, if you will, approach to research to create as a control condition kids who get virtually nothing, or who get stuff that, you know, that's probably ineffective. And then whatever you do, is likely to show some difference in regards to the quote unquote business as usual control. But that's not your point. Your point is, I think, in my view, a more interesting one, which is we need to not think, and tell me if I'm misrepresenting, that we really need to think of the control group as a comparison group.
Right.
So So we've got,
I found when we looked at, and we did a regression analysis of like 3,000 effect sizes we had, and we found that if the control group components overlapped with the treatment groups as they were defined in the literature, we found the effect size wasn't very large. So it would seem to me that we need to develop our comparison groups with those components, and then when we have a treatment, we might have a little overlap, but we'd be assessing something else that is different from that comparison condition. Right. As it is now, it's kind of hit or miss. You have a treatment as usual, you do an efficacy study, you find sorts of changes, but we don't have any canon or standard to put it against.
Right.
And so until we develop those standards, and when we're talking about change, it's going to be a little hard.
Right.
To,
knowing that doc students are going to be listening to some of this, I think it may be important to point out to them to make sure that they understand what we understand, which is that I think an important advantage of creating a comparison group is that the comparison group, by definition, gets knowable treatment components. Right. And the experimental group is changing in a very deliberate and probably not a very large way so that you can determine the value added of the difference that you're implementing in the experimental group.
Yeah, well said. Well said. That's exactly what I would...
So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'd like to read question number 4. As we learn more about cognition and human development, do you expect the field will move more in an idiopathic or nomothetic direction in the design and implementation of our interventions? Is your specific area of research likely to see such change? I think, Lee, for clarity's sake, I think what we're talking about here is, a lot of the work that my colleagues and I are doing right now in reading and math are not what I would call idiopathic work. We are developing, in RTI terminology, we're trying to develop more intensive tier 2 interventions. These are standard protocols, but they're more intensively conceived. Right. Do you think that cognitive training, with or without embeddedness in instruction, has a future as a good standard protocol, or do you see it as having potential for eventually being applied on a case-by-case, kid-by-kid basis?
Well, that's a good question. I've read reviews of executive processing, and I just read a report from that IES is going to have coming out as a reviewer, and I've looked at the literature there, and I think we're making progress in the questions we're asking, but I don't think that we're finding, as we're making advances in better defining some of these constructs, I don't know if we're to the point of actually teaching those particular
Lee, we lost your audio there.
Oh, you did?
Oh,
okay.
We got it back.
Okay. I just don't think we're at the point of instructing in those particular areas until we get more information. I mean, there was a literature review just recently in a Review of Educational Research on executive processing, and after I was a reviewer on that, and after you're done with that, you sort of think, well, it is conceptually well-founded, but when it actually gets to the point of do changes in these particular areas yield outcomes that we're interested in within the classroom, I think it's the literature's wanting on those particular areas. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't go in those directions as such, but I think we have to be very cautious in terms of whole-scale kinds of things in terms of an intervention. I don't think we need to teach at I don't think we're in a position that we teach kids to how to monitor their mental processes more efficiently in general is going to help them in a lot of areas. And specifically when we're dealing with kids at risk, I'm wondering if the top-down or higher cognition sorts of things should be clearly emphasized in a general sense at this particular point. It doesn't mean that I don't think the literature is going to come along, but I'm just very cautious because when I look at some of the links, they're just not there. So I do know from some of my own research a little bit in problem solving, we find interactions in our data with working memory and problem solving cognitive strategies. And cognitive strategies for some kids work, and for some kids it doesn't work. And the kids that we're looking at are kids all at risk, and we find this interaction. So it seems to suggest that if we came out and taught kids how to better deal with information, that it's going to be effective overall. So, I think, I guess my feeling is still before we come up with general global things in the cognitive area, we need to kind of step back and say, well, are some things, do some things interact with the treatment outcomes, and do some things not interact or just a main effect? And I think if you have a lot of main effect, I hate to put this in statistical terms, but that's a lot of the things we have to deal with. I think if we can find some of these cognitive measures that just have main effects and that's it in terms of treatment, then I think maybe we can begin to sort of investigate sort of this monolithic approach or a global approach to dealing with kids. So I don't know. So I'm still working that out.
Yeah. Well, another question that may require you to work things out. What areas of study would you regard as both very important and very understudied?
Well, that's a good question. There are a lot of areas. Well, for one, I can just look at historically the field of learning disabilities. How is it that kids who can't read have normal intelligence? Somebody needs to tell me how they got to that particular point. And so we don't study those points of how they got from, X to Y. We just know the discrepancy. There's just a lot of issues, and we don't sort of bother with it because we find kids that don't have a discrepancy perform the same as kids that do have a discrepancy, and therefore we discount that whole difference process. But in fact, there are some things that we need to be investigating of how certain things happen with kids as they're able to compensate in various ways. And we have not grabbed onto that and sort of there's just different routes to get to an answer to some sorts of questions. There's different routes of the way you can problem solve. There's different routes of the way you think about certain things. And we haven't really sat down to figure out how that occurs. For example, I think, if you have measures that kids perform the same on, for example, learning disabled kids and non-disabled kids, how is it that they can get to maybe the solution, but what sort of routes are they using to get to that particular solution? And they might come to at it a completely different way, and we really haven't investigated the routes. What we look at is the fact that there are differences in the outcome on a task. We compare the two groups, but we don't really look at the fact that when we find tasks that they don't differ on, did they use different routes to get to that particular situation? And I think that's
a great point.
I think that's an under-investigated area.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I think in terms of, I'm finishing reading a meta-analysis of the fMRI literature because I'm writing a chapter, and trying to connect it to cognitive measures and stuff in terms of how that links to the fMRI literature. But we find in terms of our research, we have this distance. We have this tremendous distance between the neuropsych people or the MD people and the cognitive people or the educators in terms of actually linking those two pieces of data together. And so, and I don't think they're completely independent. I don't think a person who takes neurological data finds it that interesting to look at regions that are underactivated or overactivated without getting access to how the kids are responding under instruction, in terms of how it sort of changes in terms of the blood flow. Well, okay, so that might not tell you much about intervention, but it tells you a little bit about, how kids are responding, and you can sort of look at sort of changes. So I think the research sort of linking, finding neurological analogs to what happens in the classroom is sort of an under-investigated area.
Yeah. So are some of these areas, are you intending to pursue some of these areas in the next half of your career?
Yeah, no. I'm working on a chapter right now for the American Academy of Sciences, sort of linking the fact that we've done meta-analysis on cognition for math disabilities and reading disabilities, and for both children and adults, and been published in RER and so forth. So we kind of know that there's differences in the group, but we're trying to link it to some of the information, the meta-analysis have been done, taking the brain sciences literature, and so we're kind of going through the meta-analysis literature there. It's a little hard, and then you have those sort of two. You have sort of this dichotomy of disciplines. And then you come to the fact of intervention. I'm thinking, where does that's kind of like part of a trinity there. Where does that sort of come in here in terms of sort of linking those two pieces of information? I think they're complementary. I just don't think we figured out how to make them complementary. I mean, RTI tells us something about manipulations in the classroom, and the neuropsych literature tells us something about why things are occurring or not occurring. But how we put those two things together is sort of missing, I think.
Okay, I found this to be really interesting. I'm mindful of time, your time especially. Let's close with the last question, which asks you what papers or other resources you might recommend the NCLII scholars to better understand some of what you've been talking about.
Well, I can just only say for my doctoral students, I always have them in every class do a meta-analysis of literature. I have so many meta-analyses done, I'm almost sick of it. But we've gone through. But I think the doctoral students need to understand what we're talking about in terms of the data across the literature. I don't like them to get tied up to a particular study or overemphasize a particular study. We need the pattern across the whole area. So, I always assign, for example, I assign your chapter on what you did years ago with Lipsy in terms of, to read that about a meta-analysis in terms of outcomes. I assign some of the things we've done and others in terms of actually, so I would direct doctoral students, they need to look at what the intervention literature looks like, for example, across a number of studies. I think, Russell Gersten has done some interesting stuff, although he kind of came up with a controversial piece that I think IES just published on RTI, which I thought, well, that's interesting, But anyway, but they have to get a feel for the literature in a general sense, first of all. And so they don't get fixated on any one particular study. And so I can't think of a single meta-analysis. It just depends what the question is, I guess. But I would say that. So on my course outline list, I usually list studies that have been published that are meta-analysis, and I have students read those first. And then we can begin to talk about more specific things.